Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printed here, and in today's video I'll be introducing Django REST Framework. So Django REST Framework is a topic that a few people have requested, and I know why, because a lot of people need to build APIs for their projects, so it makes sense. If you're using Django and you want to build an API, then Django REST Framework is something that you probably want to use. So in this video I'm going to introduce it, and then in future videos I'll cover more details about it, but you'll see how easy it is to get something up and running with the Django REST Framework in this video. So to start off, I need to install it. So let me go to my terminal and I'm going to install Django REST Framework. So pip install Django REST Framework. And I already have Django installed, of course. So this is going to take a moment to install. And once it installs, I'll be able to actually use it. Okay, so it's installed now, and I'm just going to activate my virtual environment. And now what I want to do is I want to start up a Django project. So I'm going to start project. I'm going to call this API example. So Django-admin start project, and I'll call this API example. Okay, so now that I have the API example project created, I am going to navigate into that directory, and I'm going to migrate the existing models that I have. So basically the user stuff. And then I'm going to, let's create a super user. So create super user. And I forgot the manage.py in the middle of that. So manage.py create super user. And I'll just use Anthony, and then put in a password, and I didn't type that correctly. Let's try that again. And it doesn't want to create this password, so I'll try a different one. I'm just using password 1, and this one has the P capitalized and it still won't let me do it. So I'm just trying to figure out my typical password for these things so I don't forget, because like these are just sample projects and I don't want to create real passwords, so I have to remember those. So I just create like a really simple password. But what I'll do is create super user again. Username Anthony, email address anthony@prettyprinted.com, and then I'll call this secret 11. Okay, so secret 11 is the password with the capital S. Okay, now that I got that down, that was probably the hardest part of the app. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another app inside of this project, or the first app. So Python manage.py start app should be, and I want to create an app called languages. So this is basically going to be an API to return a list of languages and update a list of languages. Nothing complicated, but it is just an example project. So now I should have the folder here, and I do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the relevant apps to my installed app. So first I'm going to add the REST Framework app, because that's really important, of course. So it's just REST_framework as the app. Then I'll add the app that I just created, which is called languages. So languages just like that. And with that, that should be everything that I need for the settings. So now that I have the settings done, what I want to do is let's start by editing the URLs for this. I don't have the URLs for the actual API yet, but I'm going to point to the URLs that I'm eventually going to create in languages, just so I don't have to come back to this base URLs file anymore. So I'll import include, and then the path is just going to be the index, and then include languages.urls. So I'm going to copy this and basically use this as a base for my languages one. So languages, I'll create a new file, and it's going to be urls.py. And basically it's going to be almost the same thing except for removing the admin part. And then this part is going to change. So I'll just comment that out. I'll just leave it blank for now. And then when I get back to that part, you'll see that I have to actually add something into the URL patterns, of course. Okay, so I can close out the URLs for the project as a whole. And now what I want to do is I want to start thinking about what I want to accomplish with my API. So with this particular API, like I said, I want to be able to display a list of languages. So that list of languages will be programming languages. So like C, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, and so on. And just to keep the model simple, when I create it in a second, I'll only use 2 columns. So I'll have a name, obviously, and I'll have another column. Let's call it paradigm, meaning, is this language procedural? Is it functional? Is it object oriented? Or whatever the paradigm could be. So to start with my API, the first thing I need is some kind of model, because of course the API is going to be requesting models from the database or updating those models in some way. So I need to create a model first. So I'll go to my models.py file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply create a single model, and I'll call this model language. And then it's going to inherit from models.model. And then, like I said, it's going to have 2 columns. One is going to be a name, so models, and it's going to be a car field. And let's just say the max length is 50. And then same thing for the paradigm. It's going to be a car field, max length of 50. Okay, so that's all I need for the models. Now that I have the model, I can go ahead and actually migrate that. So I'll use Python manage.py make migrations. And then I'll migrate it. So migrate. And now that has been migrated. So it actually exists in my database. If I were to go to the admin dashboard, which I could do right now. So Python manage.py run server. If I go to the admin dashboard, so /admin, username is Anthony, password is secret11. I will be able to see that in my admin once I add it to the admin. So let me go to admin here, and then from.models import language, and then admin.site.register, and then pass in that model. So language, save that. And now when I refresh, I should see it. I see languages there, and there's nothing in it, of course, because I haven't added anything. And I'm not going to add anything through the admin dashboard because I want to use the API to take care of everything. So even though I could add a language here, I'm not going to do it because I think it's more instructive to see it through the API. So let's go back to my project. And now that I have the models done, the next thing I have to think about is a serializer. So what a serializer does in the context of an API is it translates to and from JSON, or technically it can be any format that you can send over HTTP, like, XML or something like that. But for our purposes, it's going to be JSON. So what I mean by this is a JSON object is basically composed of the equivalent of lists and dictionaries. It's actually arrays and objects, but in Python speak, it's lists and dictionaries. So you send over lists and dictionaries through the request, and then the serializer will deserialize that combination of lists and dictionaries into whatever your application object is. In our case, a language, because you can't send a language model over HTTP. Like, you can't send someone your language model. It only exists inside of your app. So you have to send a common format for the data, and that common format is JSON. So the serializer will translate to and from JSON. So the serializer can be defined explicitly using Django REST Framework, but part of the magic of it, or what makes it easy to use, is if you use a standard use case, which you probably will for a lot of your models, then you can actually just use one of the serializers that they give you from the framework itself, the REST framework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file called serializers. So serializers, make sure I spell that right. And inside of serializers, the first thing I'm going to do is import serializers. So from REST framework, I'm going to import the serializers module. So serializers. And then I want to import the model that I just created. So from .models import language. So I'm going to create a serializer. I'm going to call this the language serializer. And I'm going to use that serializers that I just imported this module. So serializers dot, and then I'm going to specify some serializer. So the one that is very typical for people to use in a REST API is something called the model serializer. And basically what this does is it will show you the information that is relevant to your model. So basically all the fields that you want. And it also has the functionality to create new models or new objects in your model. So it can create a new language for you, and it can also update the language for you. So that's something that the serializer is giving you, and you don't have to explicitly create yourself. You could create that yourself if you wanted to. Basically, you would create methods that specify what happens every time an object gets created, what happens every time an object gets updated. But if you're doing the standard thing with your API, which is basically viewing the data and updating it in a pretty consistent way, then you can just use the serializer that comes with Django REST Framework. So it just depends on your use case, and perhaps in future videos, I'll cover the more explicit version of this. But for right now, I'm just going to import the model serializer. And to use this, I'm going to create a meta class. And inside that meta class, you need to specify two attributes. So you're going to specify a model, and you're going to specify the fields for that model. So as you can imagine, the model for this serializer is going to be language. And the fields are the fields that I want to display. So I want to display an ID, which is something that comes when I import models.model. And I want to display the name and the paradigm. So this is just a tuple of all the columns that you want to display. So ID, name, and then paradigm, just like that. And then once I have that, I'm actually done with the serializer. So this model serializer is going to take care of all the extra stuff for us that we don't have to think about. We don't have to think about exactly how to translate JSON into our model, because the model serializer will be able to figure it out for us. It's kind of like using model form when you're using forms. You don't have to specify the form again, because the patterns are so consistent that you can just inherit something that will take care of things for you if you're using a case where things are pretty consistent and you're using it in a standard way. So I'm done with the serializer. Now that I'm done with the serializer, I want to move on to the views. So the views in this case can also be done very explicitly, or you can take some shortcuts by just inheriting something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import view sets from REST Framework. So from REST Framework, import view sets. And then I'm going to import both my model and the serializer that I just created. So from models, import language. I just created that. And from serializers, I'm going to import that language serializer that I just created a moment ago. And as you can imagine, I'm going to create a view, and I'm going to call this language view. And then I'm going to inherit from this view sets. So view sets, it's a module. And inside that module, I actually want to inherit the model view set class. And this model view set class is going to take care of a lot of stuff for us. Typically, if you were going to do this explicitly, you'd have to handle every single case. So you have to say, okay, this is what I want to happen when it's a GET request. This is what I want to happen when it's a POST request. This is what I want to happen when it's a PUT request or delete request, and so on. But those are pretty standard methods in a REST API, and everyone knows what they're supposed to do. And because it's so consistent and it's probably something that you want to use, instead of defining everything explicitly, you can just inherit this model view set and it's going to take care of that for you. So instead of handling every case explicitly, the only thing you have to specify is how to get the objects from the database and the serializer class that is going to be used for those objects in the database. So I'm going to specify a query set, and I'm going to specify a serializer class. So serializer underscore class. And of course, I'm sure you can figure out the serializer class is going to be the language serializer that I just created. And the query set is actually going to be pretty simple as well. It's just asking, how do I get all the information from the database? And you just give it a query. So language, objects, all. So you're just going to query that table and return all the objects. And then this model view set will figure out how to use those particular objects in a particular way. It will cover both the cases where you can get a list of all the objects, and it will cover the case where you're just getting a very specific object. So this will make more sense when you actually see the API in action, but that's basically what the model view set is doing. So now that I have the views done, I can go on to the URLs. So I'll go back to my URLs file here. And what I want to do is I'm going to import the views module. So from .import views. So I have access to that language view that I just created. And I also want to import something called routers from REST Framework. So from REST underscore framework, import routers. And with this routers, it's going to take care of generating all the URLs for my particular model. So think about it. When I go to my URL, I want to type something like myurl.com/languages, right? And with /languages, if I perform a GET request, I expect to see all of the different languages in my database. If I perform a POST request on that same URL, then I expect to be able to create a new language. If I do languages/some ID, so let's say languages/1, I'm asking for the first language in my database, and so on. So instead of doing that explicitly, once again, Django REST Framework makes it easier for us to generate this if we're doing it in the very standard, consistent way. So to use this, I'm going to create a router just based off of something called the default router, which handles the case that everyone is familiar with. So routers.default router, just like that, instantiate it. Then I'm going to register the views that I have. So router.register. And the first argument is going to be the endpoint. So in this case, I want my endpoint to be languages. And then the second argument is going to be the actual view for this that the calling the URL will send the request to. So views.language view, just like that. So now that I have the router, the last thing I need to do is have it here in the URL patterns. So my path is just going to be the index, and then I'm going to include router.urls. So even though you can't see the URLs here, they're being generated for you, and you can simply call router.urls to have access to all those URLs. So you're just passing it here in the path. And another nice thing that this does is it creates a nice HTML view for you, so you can visually see how your API is working, in addition to calling it using some kind of client application like Postman or curl or whatever you use to perform requests. So that should be it. Hopefully I didn't make any mistakes. So my server restarted, but I'll just restart it just to make sure there are no errors. So I don't see any errors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my index, and hopefully I'll get to see the default page for my API. And this page should be generated by that default router. So click there, and I see it here. So I see something called the API root. And here I see what I have available to look at. So I see languages here, and it gives me a URL for languages. So if I just click that, I see what should be a list of languages, but I don't see anything, and that's expected because I don't have any languages in the database. And then I see a form that allows me to post something. So let's try that. As you can imagine, this will allow me to post some data into the database. So I'm going to create a programming language, Java, and the paradigm will be object oriented. And if I hit post, It will then tell me that this was created, and it gives me an ID, and it gives me the name and the paradigm back. So if I go back to my API root and then I click on languages again, I see one language in the database, Java. So now let's try a second one. Let's try C, and we'll say procedural for C as a paradigm. Post. It gives me the detail for C. It tells me the ID that it just created for me. If I go back to the roots and then click languages again, I now see the two languages in here. So if I go back to my admin dashboard and go to languages, I see the language object 2 and the language object 1. If I just update my models to actually return, so I think it's stir and then return self.name, just so we can see the name here, and then refresh this. Okay, I see C and Java. So I didn't add those through the admin dashboard. I added them through the API by performing a post request. And if I go to something like Postman and type in my URL, so it's going to be 127.8,000/languages, send a GET request, I see the same data. But because I'm sending this through Postman and not my browser, I only get the JSON data back. So it can tell where the request is coming from. If the request is coming from a browser, it's going to return HTML like this. If it's coming from some kind of client that performs requests like Postman, then it's only going to return the JSON object, which is what this is right here. So just know that if I switch this to post request, then I pass in a JSON object with a new paradigm. So let's say body, raw, JSON, and I'll create another one. So name is going to be Ruby, and then the paradigm is going to be object oriented. So I'm just sending a JSON object as a post request to that endpoint. So let's see what happens. I get ID3 back, Ruby, and then object oriented. So if I go back to GET requests and I perform send, it gives me Ruby in the list. And of course, if I go here and I look at languages, I see Ruby. So it works through both the front end, like a browser, and it works through some kind of client. So that's just for convenience. Maybe when your app is live, you wouldn't have this view, or maybe you would. And of course, you can have permissions, so they won't be able to modify this without logging in first, but I'll get to that in another video. But for now, anybody can add things into the database. So now, like I said, the router will generate the URLs for both the list view, which I'm looking at now, and the detail view. So the detail view is just, the endpoint / the ID. So if I go to like /2, then it gives me the language instance, and it's telling me that this is the result for C. And I can modify this here. So if I put procedurals and hit put, then it changes that procedural to procedurals. And if I could delete it and hit put, then it updates it. And of course, I can just hit the delete button here. And then when I go back to my language list, I see that C is no longer there because I deleted it from the database. So as you can see, Django REST Framework did a lot for us with very little code. I really, beyond my model, which is pretty standard, I only added the serializer, which is 4 lines of code. And then I had to use the model view set, and it's 3 lines of code. And they have different types of serializers and different types of view sets. Like for instance, if I wanted this to be a hyperlinked model view set, what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to see the actual URL for the resource that gets returned. So instead of seeing ID 1, I can say something like, show me the URL for this resource instead. So I'll go back to my serializer, and instead of returning the ID, I can return the URL. And then when I go here, if this works without crashing, did it crash? Yeah, so hyperlinked model view set is, it's not the view set, it's the serializer. So if I just remove that hyperlinked from there and go to the serializer, it's a hyperlinked lowercase l, model serializer. Okay, so that worked. And now if I go here, I see a URL instead of the ID. I can have both the ID and the URL if I just add the ID to the fields if I want. So ID, URL, name, and paradigm. And I see ID 1. Here's the URL. I can simply click on it because it's a link, and it returns the detail for that particular thing in the database. So as you can see, using Django REST Framework is really easy to do. And if you have a very standard idea of an API in mind, then it won't take that much code to get it up and running. If you want to customize things more, then of course it's going to take more code, and you're going to lose some of that ease that you get with like the serializer here or the model view set here, but it's still fairly straightforward. It just depends on your use case, and I'll probably cover those things in future videos. So that's it for this video. I just wanted to introduce Django REST Framework to you. If you have any questions about Django REST Framework, you can always leave a comment down below and I'll get to it. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. And also, if you haven't checked out my website, prettyprinted.com, let me just show you. You can check out the free courses I have there. I'm working on a Django course, both a premium course and a free course for Django, so look out for that. And you can get the Django cheat sheet if you want that by going to prettyprinted.com/Django, and then you can just sign up for the course that just has the PDFs for all the cheat sheets that I created. So that's it for this video. Check out my site, like this video like I said, and I will talk to you next time.